Welcome, the anointed ones. They didn't misunderstand you. They miscalculated you. And that mistake cost them everything. For years, people watched you with that same tilted head look, like you were some kind of unsolved problem. Too intense, too quiet, too unpredictable. One day you were locked in, hyper-focused, 10 steps ahead of everyone. The next day you disappeared without explanation, cut people off without speeches, changed direction without warning. To them, it looked chaotic, random, a little unhinged. They whispered it when you left the room. Something's off. Why are they like that? Are they okay? And the classic label they slapped on you like a cheap sticker. Crazy, not because you were irrational, but because you didn't behave in ways they could predict. Here's the truth most people don't realize. History has a strange habit of calling sharp minds mad before calling them brilliant. Psychologists even have a name for it. When someone's perception runs ahead of the group assumes something is wrong with the person, not their own understanding. It's easier to label than to admit, I don't get how their brain works. So instead of studying you, they diagnosed you. Instead of learning from you, they laughed at you. They thought your silence meant you were socially awkward. It was observation. They thought your distance meant you were cold. It was discernment. They thought you were overthinking. You were calculating outcomes like a chess engine. While they were playing checkers with feelings and impulse, you were mapping consequences 3 months ahead like it was nothing. And honestly, sometimes you even let them keep believing it, because correcting people takes energy, and watching them confidently underestimate you is kind of hilarious. It's like someone bringing a spoon to a sword fight and saying, "Yeah, I'm ready." You almost want to wish them luck. What they called madness wasn't instability. It was independence. You didn't follow the emotional herd. You didn't panic when everyone else panicked. You didn't explain every move for approval. You moved when it made sense to you, not when it looked normal to them. That alone unsettled people. Because society is comfortable with predictable. Predictable can be controlled. Predictable can be manipulated. But you never moved on cue. And that's where the shift happened. Slowly, quietly. The same people who joked about you started noticing something uncomfortable. The things you warned about kept happening. The people you avoided kept proving you right. The risks you refused kept blowing up in their faces. The moves you made that looked random somehow kept working out with surgical precision. Patterns don't lie. So now the laughter sounds forced. Now the whispers sound nervous. Now they're watching you closer. Because it finally hit them. You weren't spiraling. You weren't confused. You weren't unstable. You were strategic this whole time. And today we're breaking down the truth they didn't see coming. How everything they mocked as madness was actually discipline, pattern recognition, emotional control, and psychological intelligence operating at a level they couldn't comprehend. They thought you were losing it. Turns out you were calculating it. Let's talk about it. Number 1. You weren't unstable. You were operating on information they didn't have. They called you dramatic, paranoid, extra, said you were doing too much over small things. But what they never understood is this. You were never reacting to what was happening in front of you. You were reacting to what was quietly building underneath. While everyone else judged moments, you judged patterns, and patterns tell the truth long before people do. Most people live life scene by scene. They wait for proof to slap them in the face before they move. You never worked like that. You noticed the tiny shifts nobody else respected. A change in tone, a forced smile, a story that didn't line up with last week's version. A promise that sounded rehearsed instead of real. Little things, almost invisible things. But to you, those details stacked up fast, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. By the time something finally happened, you were already mentally packed and gone. That's why they thought you were unstable, because to them, your decisions looked sudden. You cut people off out of nowhere. You left situations for no reason. You stopped trusting someone too quickly. But it was never out of nowhere. They just weren't paying attention like you were. It's funny how people who miss every red flag will call you crazy for seeing them early. You weren't guessing. You were calculating. Your brain was constantly scanning for inconsistencies, weighing behavior, comparing words to actions. You weren't emotional. You were analytical. Quietly analytical. And analytical people scare those who run purely on vibes and denial. They needed explosions to believe something was wrong. You only needed smoke. So when you moved early, they laughed. When you warned them, they rolled their eyes. When you stepped back, they said you were overthinking. Then months later, everything you sensed unfolded exactly the way you predicted. Suddenly, the crazy one looks accurate. The truth is simple and uncomfortable for them. You weren't unstable at all. You were just informed. And nothing frustrates people more than someone who sees the storm forming while they're still admiring the clouds. Number 2. Your distance wasn't antisocial. It was data collection. They swore you were bad at people, said you were awkward, quiet, too reserved, like something was wrong with you because you didn't jump into every conversation or fight for attention in every room. To them, if you weren't talking, you must not know how to. If you weren't sharing, you must not have anything to offer. They confused silence with weakness. What they didn't realize is that while they were busy performing, you were studying. You weren't disconnected. You were observant. There's a huge difference. Most people walk into a room trying to be seen. You walk in trying to see everything. Who talks too much? Who interrupts? Who laughs too hard? Who changes their personality depending on who they're standing next to? Who gossips? Who listens? Who lies smoothly? Who fakes confidence? You catch all of it without saying much at all. And the funny part? People reveal more when they think you're not paying attention. When someone thinks you're quiet or harmless, they relax around you. They drop the mask. They overshare. They confess things they shouldn't. They expose their habits, their insecurities, their motives. Meanwhile, the loudest person in the room learns nothing because they're too busy trying to impress everybody. But you leave with a full psychological profile. They called it antisocial because they couldn't understand why you didn't need constant noise. You didn't chase validation. You didn't beg to belong. You didn't force fake laughter just to fit in. You were comfortable standing back and letting people show you exactly who they were. That's not isolation. That's intelligence. Distance gave you clarity. While they got emotionally tangled in drama, you stayed detached enough to see the truth. You knew who to trust, who to avoid, and who would eventually betray themselves, not because you guessed, but because you watched long enough. And here's what really bothered them. You always seemed 2 steps ahead socially without even trying, because while they were talking, you were learning. While they were bonding blindly, you were gathering leverage. You weren't bad at people. You just refused to be careless with access to you. Number 3. Your emotional control terrified them because they survive on reactions. Most people don't actually want peace. They want reactions. Reactions make them feel powerful. A raised voice, a defensive speech, tears, panic, long explanations. That's what they feed on. That's how they measure control. If they can push a button and you explode, they feel important. If they can upset you, they feel dominant. For a lot of people, drama is currency. And you accidentally broke the whole system because you didn't react the way they expected. When they tried to provoke you, you stayed calm. When they tried to insult you, you stared back steady. When they tried to guilt-trip you, you didn't rush to defend yourself. No emotional fireworks, no performance, just control. To you, it felt normal. To them, it felt unnatural. They kept thinking, why aren't they reacting? That question bothered them more than any argument ever could. People are comfortable when they can predict your emotions. If they know you'll yell, they prepare for yelling. If they know you'll cry, they prepare to manipulate sympathy. But when you give them nothing readable, no cracks, no obvious triggers, they feel blind. And nothing scares a manipulator more than losing their emotional grip. So they labeled you cold, heartless, detached, weird, not because it was true, but because they couldn't control you. What they called coldness was actually discipline. You felt everything, you just didn't let feelings drive the car. You didn't hand your steering wheel to anger or fear like everyone else. You paused, you processed, you chose your response carefully. That's strength most people never develop. They thought you didn't care. The truth is you cared enough not to let temporary emotions ruin permanent decisions. While they were out here burning bridges mid-argument and sending messages they regret at 2 a.m., you stayed composed. You watched. You calculated. You responded only when it mattered. And that calm energy did something strange. It exposed everybody else. Their tantrums looked childish next to your control. Their chaos looked sloppy next to your steadiness. Without trying, you became the mirror that showed them how unstable they actually were. And nothing unsettles people more than someone they can't emotionally shake. Number 4. You asked questions that exposed lies too fast. You didn't argue louder than people. You didn't try to dominate conversations. You didn't need speeches or long debates to win a point. All you really did was ask simple, direct questions. Calm voice, straight face, nothing dramatic. And somehow, that alone made people nervous, because most lies don't survive basic clarity. While everyone else accepted stories at face value, you slowed things down. You didn't just nod and move on. You asked, how? When? Why did that change? Small questions, normal questions, the kind that shouldn't be a problem unless someone is hiding something. That's when you noticed it. The stuttering, the sudden defensiveness, the story getting rearranged mid-sentence, the irritation that shows up way too fast for an innocent person. You weren't attacking them. You were just shining light. And light makes fake things fall apart quickly. People who tell the truth usually stay calm. They explain once and move on. But liars hate follow-up questions, because every extra detail is another chance to slip. So when you kept calmly digging, they didn't see curiosity. They felt pressure. And instead of admitting their story had holes, they flipped it on you. Why are you interrogating me? Why do you overthink everything? Why are you so suspicious? Notice how fast the blame shifted. That's how you knew you hit something real. You weren't suspicious. You were precise. You didn't let charm distract you. You didn't let confidence fool you. You didn't let loud personalities rush you past logic. You treated words like evidence, not entertainment. If something didn't add up, you stopped right there. Most people avoid that moment because it's uncomfortable. They'd rather protect the vibe than protect the truth. You didn't. And that made people uneasy around you, because they couldn't just say anything and expect you to swallow it. They actually had to make sense. Around you, lies had to work overtime. And deep down, they knew something frustrating. You weren't hard to deal with. You were just hard to fool. Number 5, your overreactions were actually early warning systems. They mocked you for leaving situations too quickly, for cutting people off too soon, for noticing patterns they didn't even see. They said you overreacted, called you dramatic, told you to calm down and give people more chances. What they didn't understand is that what looked like overreaction to them was actually a finely tuned radar, picking up signals they were too blind to notice. Every time you stepped back, every time you paused, every time you removed yourself from someone or something, it wasn't impulsive. It was preemptive. You were responding to small inconsistencies, tiny changes in tone, subtle behaviors that others ignored because they didn't seem important yet. To them, these were minor issues. To you, they were breadcrumbs leading to a bigger picture. You didn't need the chaos to explode in front of everyone to know it was coming. You saw it months before it became visible. That's why you moved early. That's why you didn't beg or negotiate with nonsense. That's why you walked away before anyone else could. It wasn't emotional. It was tactical. It was a way to protect yourself from consequences that others treated as inevitable. They assumed your distance meant you were fragile, that you panicked at the first hint of trouble. In reality, you were reading the pattern, calculating the risk, and acting faster than anyone else could catch up. And when the things you anticipated actually unfolded, they were shocked. Suddenly your overreaction didn't look like overreaction at all. It looked like foresight. It looked like you had some secret insight no one else possessed. The same people who called you dramatic were now scrambling, trying to figure out how you saw it coming. You weren't emotional. You weren't extreme. You weren't too sensitive. You were awake in a world that preferred to be asleep, alert in a world that ignored the warning signs, and prepared in a world that panicked too late. What they called drama, you called survival. What they called impatience, you called accuracy. And that's why, in the end, the very people who mocked your reactions were forced to watch as you predicted every move and left them scrambling in your wake. Number 6, you broke social rules on purpose, not by accident. People assumed you didn't fit in because you didn't follow their invisible script. You laughed at the jokes you didn't find funny. You smiled when respect was missing. You nodded when someone demanded agreement you didn't feel. You didn't do it out of awkwardness. You did it on purpose. You saw the rules for what they were, a social performance everyone else felt obligated to follow, a game designed to keep them predictable and controllable. And you refused to play like everyone else. Most people are busy performing every second. Fake enthusiasm here, forced politeness there, a laugh tucked in at the right moment. Also, nobody notices the cracks in their performance. But you weren't performing for approval. You weren't pretending to fit into someone else's script just to make them comfortable. That refusal was quiet, subtle, and deeply unsettling to them. People around you felt the gap immediately, even if they couldn't name it. Something about you didn't respond to the cues they expected. You weren't awkward. You were conscious. You were deliberate. Breaking social rules gave you insight. Every fake smile, every overhyped story, every attempt to impress revealed who they really were. You didn't need them to confess. Their behavior said everything. People reveal more when someone isn't performing to the same standard. You weren't rejecting society. You were using it as a mirror. Every norm you ignored reflected the truth of those around you. And here's the most terrifying part for them. The more unpredictable you were, the harder you were to manipulate. They couldn't use standard social pressures on you. They couldn't anticipate your moves because you weren't moving by their rules. The laughter that was supposed to include you instead exposed them. The small favors they expected you to reciprocate didn't bind you. Their manipulations hit a wall. You weren't socially broken. You were strategically free. You weren't failing the rules. You were mastering the room without pretending. And that's why they called you strange. Because true independence always looks unusual to people who survive by playing roles. Number 7. Your mind simulated worst-case scenarios, so reality couldn't surprise you. While everyone else was living in the moment, hoping things would work out, you were quietly rehearsing disasters. Not because you were pessimistic or paranoid, but because you understood one simple fact. Life doesn't give warnings before it hits. People think preparation is about checking boxes or saving money or having a plan. You knew preparation was mental, emotional, and strategic. You ran every possible outcome in your head, testing them like a lab experiment. Every betrayal, every failure, every mistake that could happen, you faced it first, before anyone else even knew it existed. That's why your decisions looked sudden to outsiders. They saw you leave a person, a job, or a situation without warning. They said you overreacted. They whispered that you panicked. But in reality, you weren't reacting at all. You were executing a strategy you had been running silently for weeks, months, even years. Every worst-case scenario you simulated gave you a map, a set of moves that ensured nothing could blindside you. That's not fear. That's intelligence. That's foresight in a world that confuses reaction with bravery. The beauty of this is how effortless it looked to everyone else. While they panicked, blamed, and stumbled when events unfolded, you moved calmly. Decisions that would have broken them barely registered as a ripple in your day. You didn't waste energy reacting to chaos because you had already lived through it mentally, dressed it up, and found the path through. People thought you were lucky. They said timing was on your side. They called you uncanny. The truth was simple. You weren't lucky. You were prepared. This constant mental rehearsal didn't make you cold. It made you untouchable. You carried the weight of possibilities so that when things fell apart around others, you were already 2 steps ahead, watching the pieces align exactly as you had anticipated. And nothing terrifies people more than someone who can survive every disaster without breaking a sweat. They labeled it madness, but you knew it was mastery, the kind of quiet, relentless preparation that leaves everyone else scrambling in your wake. Number 8. You let people underestimate you on purpose. They thought they had you figured out. They sized you up in 10 seconds and wrote a report in their minds. Quiet, strange, maybe a little slow, not someone to worry about. They thought your calm was weakness, your silence was ignorance, your pauses were hesitation. And you let them believe it. Every eyebrow raise, every small nod, every time you stayed quiet while they talked, you let them underestimate you. Not because you were unaware or naive, but because being underestimated is one of the greatest advantages in any room. When people think you're harmless, they reveal everything. Their true motives, their hidden patterns, their vulnerabilities. They drop the mask because they don't expect you to notice. They overcommit, they overshare, they miscalculate. And while they're busy feeling superior, you're quietly taking mental notes. You watch, you analyze, you file away every lie, every weakness, every contradiction. You're building a map of the room, the relationships, the moves that will matter later. And the best part, they never suspect you're aware. Most people spend their energy trying to impress others, proving themselves at every turn. You did the opposite. You let the story unfold while you stayed still, calm and invisible. And that invisibility gave you leverage no one else could touch. You weren't naive or passive. You were strategic. You understood that unpredictability is power. If they assume you'll act a certain way, you can always act differently. If they believe they've cornered you, you can always slip through. Eventually, the truth shows itself. The same people who laughed, mocked, or ignored you start realizing too late that you were observing every misstep. Every weakness they thought they saw was a trap, a moment they gave you to understand them fully. By the time they notice, you're already 2 moves ahead. Underestimation is dangerous, but only for those who think it's a weakness. For you, it's a weapon. And nothing frustrates people more than discovering the quiet one they dismissed was always the one controlling the game. Number 9. You walked away without closure because you don't negotiate with disrespect. They thought you were impulsive when you cut people off. They said you overreacted, that you needed to give things another chance, that you shouldn't be so quick to walk away. But walking away wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was strategic. You learned early that once respect is gone, trying to explain yourself, justify your feelings, or demand accountability is a waste of energy. People who operate on manipulation or entitlement rarely understand boundaries. They expect you to argue, to compromise, to beg for recognition. You didn't. You didn't need to. You don't negotiate with disrespect. By stepping back, you were showing a lesson louder than words ever could. Silence carries more weight than apologies or explanations when someone doesn't understand the value of integrity. You didn't leave because you wanted revenge. You left because the situation revealed what people were willing to tolerate, and you refused to be part of that. Every step away from toxicity, every exit from manipulation, every boundary you enforced was a statement. Your peace is non-negotiable, and your time isn't up for debate. They were shocked because they weren't used to people walking away with conviction. Most would argue, grovel, or justify themselves endlessly. You didn't. You left clean, no drama, no spectacle, just action. And that action exposed everything about them, their control, their entitlement, their inability to respect you. The power of this is subtle but undeniable. By walking away without closure, you forced them to face the truth they had been avoiding. They had to confront their own behavior in the silence you left behind. It wasn't punishment. It was clarity. And for you, it was freedom. People who thrive on drama fear this because it's uncontrollable. You're not dependent on validation, explanations, or approval. You set the standard, and if someone refuses to meet it, you walk. That ability, calm, decisive, uncompromising, terrifies those who rely on manipulation to feel powerful. They called it abrupt, impulsive, or cold. You called it survival. You didn't burn bridges. You simply refused to cross over someone else's disrespect. And that's a level of control they'll never truly understand. Number 10. Your humor was dark because you already understood reality isn't soft. They thought you were twisted, weird, too blunt, too cynical. They laughed nervously at your jokes, uncomfortable with the way you pointed out things nobody else dared to say. But your humor wasn't for shock value. It wasn't a gimmick. It was honesty, raw and unfiltered. You saw the world for what it was, stripped of pretense, and your jokes reflected that truth. Life isn't soft. People aren't perfect. Systems aren't fair, and pretending otherwise is exhausting. So you didn't sugarcoat. You didn't pretend everything was okay, just to keep the peace. You laughed at the truth instead of ignoring it. Most people avoid dark humor because it forces them to confront realities they'd rather overlook. They tell safe jokes, repeat comforting lies, or avoid saying anything that might make someone uncomfortable. You didn't play that game. Your humor became a mirror, showing people themselves in ways they didn't like. That mirror made them uneasy, because suddenly they couldn't hide behind polite smiles or rehearsed small talk. They were forced to face the cracks, the absurdities, and the hypocrisies they preferred to ignore. The beauty of this is subtle but powerful. While others cling to illusions, you use humor to expose patterns, reveal contradictions, and point out hypocrisy without lecturing. It's sharper than criticism and far more effective. People laugh nervously, dismiss it at first, but the truth lands anyway. That discomfort is a form of influence. It shifts perception while leaving you untouchable. You aren't mean, you're aware. You aren't cruel, you're observant. You see what everyone else avoids, and you say it in a way that pierces the veil of ignorance. And the most frustrating part for them is that your humor works because it's accurate. It's not exaggerated, it's not fabricated for effect. It's a reflection of reality filtered through clarity. They call it dark, you call it honesty. While they scramble to hide their mistakes, avoid embarrassment, and keep their comfort intact, you walk through the world laughing quietly at the truths they fear to acknowledge. That level of awareness, wrapped in humor, is not just intimidating, it's unstoppable. Number 11. You disappeared strategically, not emotionally. They thought your absence meant you were lost, confused, or breaking down, weeks or months without a word, no explanations, no updates, and people whispered, "What's wrong with them?" They assumed chaos, assumed drama, assumed weakness. But your silence wasn't emotional. It was tactical. You didn't disappear to run from problems or feelings. You disappeared to reset, to observe, and to rebuild. While everyone else reacted to events, you were planning, refining, and preparing your next moves. You didn't need validation. You didn't need approval. You needed clarity, distance, and time to sharpen yourself. Most people confuse constant visibility with competence. If someone is quiet, people assume instability. They don't realize that real strategy often requires stepping out of the spotlight entirely. While they were busy performing for attention, you were quietly gathering insight. You studied who was trustworthy, who was predictable, who would falter when pressure arrived. Your absence wasn't avoidance, it was awareness. You were mapping the terrain without interference, calculating outcomes, and preparing to act with precision. The trick is that your absence unsettled them without you even trying. They noticed the quiet, the missing presence, the lack of explanation, and they filled the gaps with fear and assumptions. Every false narrative they created about your disappearance revealed more about them than it did about you. They were panicking, projecting, scrambling. Meanwhile, you were in control. You let time work for you, letting the world play out while you positioned yourself perfectly for what came next. And when you returned, it wasn't a comeback, it was a revelation. Suddenly, the quiet one they assumed was fragile, was the most prepared, aware, and unstoppable person in the room. The same people who doubted you were now forced to recalibrate. They realized too late that your absence was never weakness. It was preparation. Disappearing quietly gave you a level of advantage they could never anticipate, and it left them scrambling to catch up to someone who was already 3 steps ahead. Number 12. You trusted patterns over promises. They thought you were skeptical, maybe even cynical, because you didn't take words at face value. When people made grand promises, flattering claims, or confident assurances, you didn't nod and smile. You waited. You watched. You paid attention to actions, the little details, the habits, the patterns that unfolded over time. Words are cheap. Anyone can say what they want in the moment, but repeated behavior tells the truth. You understood this instinctively, and it made you almost untouchable. Most people live in a world of hope, assuming that what someone says aligns with what they do. They get burned over and over because they confuse intentions with reality. You didn't. You didn't need to hear, "I'll be there," or "I've got your back" 100 times. You only needed to see if it happened once, then twice, then consistently. That was enough. Patterns never lie. People do. By trusting patterns over promises, you refused to be manipulated. Smooth talkers, charmers, and liars who relied on words alone couldn't touch you. They thought they could persuade you, sway you, or guilt you with their assurances. You didn't give them that leverage. You let their actions speak louder than anything they could say. And while they underestimated the power of their own behavior being watched, you quietly collected data. You knew who was reliable, who was dangerous, and who would inevitably fail. This approach gave you clarity others could never achieve. While everyone else was reacting emotionally to broken promises or disappointments, you already knew what to expect. You didn't have to be surprised. You didn't have to forgive or get frustrated. You were prepared. You acted based on proof, not hope. And when the truth finally revealed itself, when people showed their true colors, when promises fell apart, when intentions crumbled, you didn't look shocked. You looked exactly as you should, calm, confident, untouchable. The same people who tried to sway you with words now realized too late that you were always operating on a deeper, far more accurate system. Trusting patterns over promises wasn't skepticism. It was mastery. It was survival. It was strategy at a level they could never replicate. Number 13. You accepted being misunderstood because explaining yourself wastes leverage. People assumed you were complicated, mysterious, or even difficult because you didn't constantly justify your actions or clarify your thoughts. They whispered that you were distant, that you didn't communicate, that nobody could figure you out. What they didn't realize is that you didn't owe anyone an explanation. You understood a truth most people never grasp. When you explain yourself to people who don't understand, you're giving them power over you. Every justification, every argument, every reason you hand out is a lever someone can use to manipulate, dismiss, or control you. So you stopped handing them levers. You accepted being misunderstood. This isn't arrogance, it's strategy. While they fussed over trying to label you, predict you, or force you into a box, you quietly let them misread everything. They assumed they could calculate your behavior or anticipate your decisions, and in doing so, they revealed themselves. The more they misjudged you, the more predictable they became. You didn't correct them. You didn't clarify. You stayed silent, and that silence became your advantage. Most people panic when they aren't fully understood. They scramble, explain, apologize, adjust, or try to perform for validation. You didn't. You knew that the fewer moving parts you gave them, the harder it was for them to manipulate you. Accepting misunderstanding turned every attempt to decode you into wasted energy for them. Every misinterpretation became a layer of protection. And the irony, by refusing to be fully seen or explained, you became more influential than they could measure. They underestimated you. They misread your intentions. And while they were busy guessing, you were moving through life with precision. They thought they were in control of the narrative. You were quietly controlling the reality. Being misunderstood isn't a flaw, it's armor. It shields you from manipulation, it amplifies your leverage, and it forces others to reveal themselves without you ever having to lift a finger. The people who think they get you are always the ones who are most exposed, and that, in the end, is the brilliance behind letting misunderstanding work in your favor. Number 14. And the madness they laughed at turned out to be precision thinking they couldn't replicate. For the longest time, people whispered, laughed, and shook their heads at the way you operated. They said your moves were erratic, your decisions unpredictable, your focus obsessive or strange. They didn't understand the rhythm behind your actions. To them, it looked chaotic, uncontrolled, almost reckless. But what they couldn't see, what they were never able to replicate, was that every pause, every silence, every seemingly random choice was calculated with surgical precision. Your mind wasn't jumping from one thought to the next. It was running simulations, weighing outcomes, and positioning you in a way that ensured maximum clarity, maximum advantage, and minimal exposure. They called it madness because they couldn't keep up. Human brains hate to admit when someone else is operating on a higher frequency, when someone sees patterns they can't even imagine. And the funny part, you didn't care if they laughed. You let them. While they underestimated you, while they misjudged your intelligence, while they tried desperately to find a flaw, you were 3 steps ahead. The chaos they imagined in your head was actually a blueprint for success, a map for navigating situations they didn't even understand existed. Everything they mocked eventually proved them wrong. Every prediction you made, every boundary you set, every subtle move that seemed impulsive at the time, it all unfolded exactly as you anticipated. And suddenly, the crazy one became the only one who looked prepared, controlled, and unshakable. They realized too late that what they called madness was actually mastery. What they labeled unpredictability was actually strategy. What they feared was the clarity and independence they lacked. By the time they understood, it was too late. They couldn't replicate it because they never developed the discipline, observation, and foresight that made your thinking lethal in its precision. The very thing they laughed at was the thing that set you apart, the invisible edge that nobody else could touch. The so-called madness wasn't chaos. It was intelligence wearing a cloak of invisibility. And that, in the end, is why they finally realized they weren't dealing with instability. They were facing brilliance they couldn't even comprehend. Conclusion. Everything we've explored today paints a picture that's impossible to ignore. What people called madness in you wasn't randomness, chaos, or instability. It was clarity, precision, and strategy wrapped in silence, observation, and emotional discipline. Every moment they labeled you too much was actually a signal of foresight. Every pause, every disappearance, every refusal to explain, every laugh at uncomfortable truths, every boundary you enforced, it wasn't reaction, it was calculation. You weren't overreacting, you weren't dramatic, and you weren't lost. You were awake, aware, and operating on a level most people can't even comprehend. They underestimated you, misread you, and tried to fit you into boxes that didn't exist, all while you quietly watched, learned, and advanced. The patience you carried, the emotional control you mastered, the subtle observation you executed, the strategic retreats you made, and the way you let misunderstanding work in your favor. These weren't flaws. They were your power, your armor, and your advantage. By the time they realized the truth, they couldn't touch you. They couldn't replicate your moves. They couldn't predict your decisions. What they called madness turned out to be intelligence too sharp, too disciplined, and too independent for them to comprehend. This isn't about proving them wrong. It's about understanding your own brilliance and using it consciously. It's about seeing that every so-called flaw they pointed out was a mark of your precision. It's about recognizing that the calm, calculated, silent observer in the corner of the room, the one they mocked, laughed at, and underestimated, is the one who ultimately controls the game. And now, you can finally own that reality without apology, without explanation, and without hesitation. If this video hit differently, make sure you don't just watch and scroll. Subscribe to the channel for more insights that uncover the brilliance behind what the world misunderstands. Like this video to support content that challenges the ordinary. Comment your thoughts. Let us know which part of this changed how you see your own strategy. And share this with someone who needs to understand that what others call madness might just be their untouchable edge. Don't just watch brilliance. Recognize it, embrace it, and let it guide every move you make. God bless you.